In their proposal for the state's operational budget, Ohio House Republicans included $600 million in the form of bonds for a new Cleveland Browns stadium. But given that there was some hesitancy about that funding structure, Republicans in the state Senate changed it from $600 million in the form of bonds to $600 million from the state's unclaimed funds. Unclaimed funds are Ohioans' money that the state had taken over, maybe because those funds were lost or abandoned by Ohioans. I spoke yesterday to Sarah Donaldson, reporter for the Statehouse News Bureau, who explained that this idea of funding the stadium actually originated in Governor Mike DeWine's operational budget proposal.
I'll actually go back to the governor's version because there's really, when we're thinking about this, there have been kind of three iterations of potential money for the Cleveland Browns. So back in February, when Governor Mike DeWine released his version of the budget, he said that, he understands that the Cleveland Browns and the Haslam family are looking to upgrade their stadium, but of course there might be other sports teams who want to do the same. So he proposed raising the sports gambling tax on operators and creating a fund for stadium construction, both new stadium construction and also stadium improvements. So House lawmakers took that and they said, I don't really want to raise taxes, even though this tax wouldn't be on folks who are gambling, it would be on the folks who actually operate the sports books. But the House said, I don't want to raise any taxes. So the House GOP took that out and they added the $600 million in bonds. So House lawmakers have said it's essentially a loan, but it's a taxpayer loan. State money is taxpayer money. So these $600 million in bonds would have been issued to the Browns. Now we're at the Senate, and there was a lot of hand-wringing about just the legality of these bonds because they were a specific type of bond. Some folks were wondering if they were constitutional. So the Senate went back to more of a grant program, kind of like what Governor DeWine was proposing, but the funding mechanism is also very different. So unclaimed funds are managed by the state and they come from Ohioans' dormant bank accounts or maybe a paycheck that they never cashed. And eventually a bank or, maybe an agency that manages someone's will and trust, they turn that money that's not been claimed over to the state. So the Department of Commerce manages this money, but I have to imagine that in the next week or couple of weeks as debate plays out over the Senate's proposal, you're going to hear from opponents who say it's not really the state's money to spend.
And we also heard from a state finance official about the bonds proposal, which was concern in a memo that basically the state wouldn't be able to foot the bill for that, on top of the fact that there was no guarantee of a return on that investment. So there were certainly those finance concerns there as well. But so far, what has been the reaction in the Senate to this new idea of using those unclaimed funds to pay for this stadium? Is this more popular than the bonds idea?
It's hard to say so far. I think we'll see as debate plays out. And also, obviously, this is really new. So I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what they think about it because the bonds had kind of been floated even before they were put in the House budget. But this is really, I think Senate Minority Leader Nikki Antonio told some reporters today, this is really the first we're hearing about the use of this unclaimed funds program. So I think people are trying to make sense of it. I do think on one end, you have people who are glad that it's not bonds because there was a lot of hesitancy over the bonds. But there is this uncomfortability with use of unclaimed funds because even though Senate Finance Chair Jerry Serino says, this money is often stuff that hasn't been touched for 10 years or more, you're also hearing from people who say, hey, well, I've tried to get that money and it hasn't worked. And I should say, part of what the Senate put forward, they do allocate some extra money to the Department of Commerce so that the Department of Commerce could resolve some of these unclaimed funds cases. Lawmakers say they don't want to take money from folks who are able to claim that money, but some of it is sitting and it's, considered abandoned.
So really there isn't a protection structure for people's money in this case, because obviously they've moved some money over in the proposal in case someone wants their money back. But is there really a structure in order to protect people's money if it ends up going towards the stadium?
I think that the money that would qualify for this, so right now, to my understanding, there's like $3.7 billion worth of unclaimed funds. And I should say, although $600 million would go in a grant toward the Browns under the Senate's proposal, they're talking about moving 1.7 billion over. So there's that 600 million for the Browns, but then there would be more money for future stadium construction. That's kind of where DeWine's idea comes back into play a little bit. Um, but Serino says the money that would be used is money that's truly considered abandoned, that it's sat in the state's coffers for more than 10 years. And I shouldn't really call it the state's coffers because, again, the Department of Commerce, the Division of Unclaimed Funds under the Department of Commerce, they're managing this money. It's not money that they're able to necessarily spend without legislative action.
And of course, the budget would end up having to be signed by Governor Mike DeWine, but we really haven't heard much from the governor regarding this after he put forth his version of what the state's operational budget should be. Is there any point in time when we can expect to hear from Governor DeWine on this or his intervention in this issue?
Yeah, it's going to be tough to say before he signs the budget because any bill in Ohio that has appropriations attached to it, like the budget, Governor DeWine can line item veto things. And he is very unlikely to say he's going to veto something before he actually vetoes it. So it's hard to say if he would veto this. He, I'm sure, is going to weigh in to some level about how he feels about this proposal. There was obviously a lot of concern in DeWine's eyes, I think, about use of the bond structure. He may be more likely to support something like this because it is structurally a little bit more like what he proposed doing with the grant program. But on the same time, we're not really sure about how he feels about use of these unclaimed funds. So we'll see.
And I'm just curious what the argument officials have been making in terms of why the state should be involved with a private sports facility. Obviously, a sports facility is not something that the government oversees. These are private operators. And so, what has been the argument for why the state should actually put up money for private business operations?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of argument that it's not just about the games that the Browns would play at this development in Brook Park. It's also that the Browns and the Haslam family who own the Browns, they would be investing heavily in the community around Brook Park, adding jobs, adding apartments, adding parking. So it's this idea of this economic investment project that's potentially going to help an Ohio community. So that's what you've heard lawmakers who have been proponents of giving this money to the Browns. And this proposal's been interesting, not just on the particulars with the bonds versus the grants versus how we give this money, but when you're talking about for the sheer reason of allocating $600 million for the Browns, no matter how that money's coming, you do have some Republican lawmakers who have sided with Democrats and have said they're just against giving this team the money, and it hasn't caused them to vote. I mean, in the House, it didn't cause them to vote against the budget outright necessarily. There were a couple Republicans who did vote against the budget, but there is some hesitancy in that exact, kind of situation that you articulate.
Yeah, and obviously we've seen this situation before when you have private interests intersect with Ohio politics, because of course the HB1 scandal, definitely a situation that a lot of people still fresh in their mind. Would you say that there still is that concern about potential interests outside of strictly business and economic development?
Speaker Matt Huffman's been asked that by some of my colleagues, including Morgan Trow at WEWS. And, of course, the Haslam family, they are major political donors in the state. Speaker Matt Huffman has countered that he, doesn't feel that Ohio lawmakers are necessarily so swayed by one interest. And that, again, the defense for this is that it is an economic investment project.
I appreciate you for joining me to offer some insight into this story.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to talk.